Hello and welcome back to Lunchtime BABLing. My name is Shea Brown. I'm the CEO of BABL AI, a company that audits algorithms for bias, ethical risk, and effective governance. I'm here today with Mahesh from Quantpi. You're a data scientist there. So I'm really excited about chatting about. I often don't get technical people on this podcast, and so it's fun to talk to a fellow scientist. And so, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Shay. Hi, everyone. I'm Mahesh. My background is in mathematical optimization. I did my PhD in mathematical optimization from University of Tübingen, and then afterwards I started doing a bit of consulting in supply chain optimization and also artificial intelligence. Then I joined Quantpi as a data scientist, where we started to basically do a lot of testing of AI black boxes and also look a bit into AI governance and compliance. But my focus is mainly towards AI testing.
Great. Yeah, QuantPi is a great company, and I mean, I think bias testing or testing, maybe not necessarily just bias, but testing of AI systems has been a pretty hot topic. And I mean, it's one of those things that there was a period of time, like with sort of ordinary AI systems that we're getting a handle on trying to figure out how to probe those systems in a black box sort of way. Um, and just as we were sort of gaining some traction on that, then generative AI comes in, and there's just a whole nother set of issues. And the old issues are still around. And so I'm curious, what are you like? What's your approach? What are the issues around black box testing these systems? And maybe explain to the people like what do we mean by black box?
So basically, black box means that you do not have any information about the internals of the model, and you would just like to check inputs and outputs, and you want to see how well it is behaving and is the behavior as intended, and so on and so forth. And as you touched upon, like since we have now new trends like Gen A and so on, it's important that AI testing also catches up with these sorts of trends. So in principle, it could be that we develop a technique to test a black box model, and it may become invalid after a certain time. So we want to keep the whatever framework which we want to use to test AI black box models, we want them to be up to the speed of development of AI. So in this sense, QuantPy, for example, we have like a framework which actually is robust in the sense of usage, like it is applicable, it's essentially model agnostic. So be it a Gen A model or a computer vision model, it's the standard versions and so on and so forth. So it really uh, is not important to know the what kind of model it is, but rather if we have an AI model and we just take inputs and outputs and we see whether the performance is as intended or not. And obviously the key question is, how do you define performance? It really depends on the use case and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's so the black box is the algorithm, yeah, and their inputs and outputs. And so in the case of some algorithms are facial recognition, some algorithms are maybe a large language model where you're going to get text in and then text out. Others are a risk assessment algorithm or like maybe credit risk or something like that. So how does, without giving away all your IP, how does QuantPy approach the fact that there's such different or such variety of inputs and outputs?
So at any on a very high level, you have a black box A model, and you have certain inputs and certain outputs, and it is totally possible to kind of get various characteristics, not just from outputs, but also from not just from inputs, sorry, but also from outputs. So we sort of cast these characteristics in a very uniformized manner, and sort of use certain performance metrics, and we can also test the performance across various dimensions, like be it bias, fairness, robustness, and also we can also check the data quality, whether it contains any biases and so on and so forth. So in this sense, the framework is quite agnostic, data agnostic, and also model agnostic. um, yeah, I think, and moreover, the way we have approached it, it's also quite flexible. in the sense a customer, for example, can use already pre-built components which we have built for them, while at the same time it allows it has the option to be flexible in the sense like customer can add their components basically, and eventually these all components come together to vary to test the performance of the black box AI model in various dimensions in a more uniformized manner. Yeah.
So maybe like maybe we'll switch. I want to get back to the technical stuff, but let's switch gears for a second. Like, what are you seeing your clients like? What's the motivation for this? What gets them to think about these issues?
Yeah, I would say many aspects, like for example, the compliance requirements. So everyone is very excited about all these compliance requirements, and they want to see if their AI models possess any risks to their enterprises, and often it is the case that the clients or the customers are not so sure about how exactly they would even test these AI models. So in this sense, it's important to understand the use case they're having in place, where exactly it is being used, and generate scenarios to actually test these AI models. But however, the tricky thing is that once you generate so many scenarios to test these AI models, you cannot cast it in a uniformized manner, or it is possible that you develop one framework to capture one scenario, another framework to capture another scenario. The tricky aspect is to be model agnostic, be it a computer vision model, be it an NLP model. The challenge is to actually cast them into one single framework, and the knowledge which, for example, customers gain by using for our testing framework on a particular model, that knowledge can be easily transferred to other use case. If they worked on NLP, it's totally possible to basically transition to computer vision and see if the performance the dimensions are suitable, or if more dimensions need to be added, more scenarios need to be considered, and so on and so forth.
That's interesting. So walk me through a little bit of what that might look like for a particular type of model. So I have a company, and yeah, let me pick a hard one. So I have a company that has I have a large language model, and I'm using that large language model to do something. Maybe I have a chatbot or so, some use case, and I'm now going to I've come to you and I say I want to make sure that this is robust, or this model is going to be compliant. And so what's the process that you would say, how do you step that client through going from I just have this model that I'm using for my business to it's in the system and you're getting reports out of it and you're seeing metrics.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good question. These are sort of the questions I usually get on a day-to-day basis. Uh, Usually, customers bring their scenario or the use case in which the AI model is being used. The very first step is to understand the use case, where exactly it is being used, how exactly it is being used, and the kind of inputs it takes, and the kind of outputs it gives out, and so on and so forth. And moreover, at the same time, we also need to understand what's critical, and what actually matters to this particular scenario. Just from a For example, let's say if we have a chatbot which needs to access certain documents in the background, and it needs to output certain answers, and it, so it could be that the main end user is uh, usually can add certain typos to the text. It could be totally possible, and ideally we want the behavior to be at least relatively robust. The difference in performance shouldn't be so much. Ideally we would want the performance to be relatively stable, so we need to generate these kind of scenarios, like the kind of typos it can tolerate, and we also need to know the limit to which we can add which the model can handle, after which the performance would sort of go down drastically, or it could be that maybe their mother tongue is something else, and they write the question in a very in a paraphrased manner. They could paraphrase this question in multiple ways, and even if you paraphrase it in multiple ways, the output should be essentially the same. So these sort of scenarios, which are actually very critical for humans, these need to be kind of generated based on the understanding of the use case. And these sort of scenarios, once generated, we could finalize the metrics. For example, if we have like a document on which we use an LLM to basically get a query for a question, sorry, to get an answer for a question, and then we could sort of generate a ground truth data set, which in itself is a challenge. Yeah, that's one of the challenge which I can come into later at a later point. But basically, once we assume that we have a ground truth data, we could essentially see how well is the performance, be it either with some kind of similarity matching or semantic similarity matching, or it could be even exact matching. But it really depends on the performance metrics which we want to consider. And the most critical aspect is the kind of scenarios which are critical for the use case. And in general, once these scenarios are done, we could run the risk assessments. Once the risk assessments are done, the main critical challenge is that how would stakeholders consume these results. So one thing is to generate the results. The other thing is that whether those results are reliable and actually are consumable. So there are lots of stakeholders in AI life cycle, as you know. So at least from Quantpi, we have like a very holistic platform where all the stakeholders can actually gain insights into their models. And this can help in many ways. One is from the risk management standpoint. The other is just operational performance, like they could improve their models, for example. And not just it, like also from a procurement standpoint, if a company wants to procure a certain model, they could actually easily compare um, various models and see which model is best for them based on their own understanding, which is also quite subjective. So based on their understanding, they could choose their own requirements, and based on those requirements, they could make the finalized decision. So in this sense, the whole platform enables the decision making for enterprises. And yes, I would say we also take really a lot of care with interpretation of the results. So it's one thing to generate those results; it's another thing to actually quantify the uncertainty in those results and sort of ensure that these results are reliable. So we have developed also a platform to actually interpret these results and so on. So that's the high level overview. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you're talking about interpret those results, like that's sort of explainability or interpretability kind of.
This is slightly different. This is based on the results of the risk assessment, I mean, not the outputs of the model. But explainability would also be a component which comes in the risk assessment. But once off, even after the risk assessment, we would need to interpret those results appropriately.
I'd love to hear more about the risk assessment. So how, because I mean that's obviously a hot topic now, and quantifying risk and trying to measure risk. So what's what is the risk assessment, and then what does it get used for later on in the sort of compliance journey?
Yeah. So usually the compliance requirements govern the configuration of the risk assessment. But in principle, as I said, like usually before even you start with the risk assessment, the most critical aspect is to consider the scenarios under which you want to test the AI model. And based on these scenarios, these scenarios can be anything with respect to maybe ethical bias or some kind of technical bias, where there is like a certain technical component which is contributing to the bias and so on and so forth. Like for example, length of a question, that can be one kind of technical bias. And there are other components like robustness. So one kind of robustness is like like adding typos to the text, and whether the model is performing reliably well or not. And also it could be that you're paraphrasing, you may be using certain slangs within the text, and we want to check whether the model is performing as intended or not. And as the most critical aspect is how do we automate all of this. And based on let's say if we have a large data, so the most critical factors or is the engine, whatever the this test performing engine, is it computationally efficient, is it model agnostic, or these test results like done in an automated manner. And these sort of things are very critical to consider for enterprises. And yeah, I think we have made a good amount of progress in this direction.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, what do you see as like in terms of your typical client? What are the what are the major challenges? You know, like what are the in this process, right? They're clearly they're working with you because they want to have a single place where they can manage their AI compliance and their testing. What is the biggest challenge you like to actually getting that process done? Like both the challenge of facing kind of prior to working with you, which probably there'll be some regulatory challenges, but then also in the process, like what do you, and another way of phrasing it might be like what would you want companies to start thinking about prior to reaching out to work with you?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I would say one of the main critical challenge would be that usually customers do not have a data set, and also to an extent um, they would not have given much thought about the kind of scenarios that are important for the use case. Like for example, as I said, the typos, or it could be even from a security standpoint, like a prompt injection to the text, for a chatbot and so on and so forth. So so just from accessibility standpoint, I would say having access to the data, the testing data, and also just in general having access to the model, uh, like maybe via API and so on, so that the customers don't need to share their models, but rather we just need the API access to do the risk assessment. And that would be one challenge, I would say. But as I said, the more critical ones are generating these scenarios and considering the right scenario that makes sense for the use case and developing the configuration accordingly.
Okay. So I think the looking from the Babel perspective, because we work with clients, we audit clients, but also we do, we consult with some clients, not at the same time, but um, to prepare for this. And for us, what that would sounds like is what we would call our risk assessment is much more of the human. It's identifying those scenarios which are related to both opportunity in terms of how is this thing supposed to function, how are people supposed to get value from it, and then the risks associated with that. So they have to understand what are the things that are important to eventually measure. And then you're saying also it would be better if you start thinking about collecting the right kind of data to measure that so that you can automate it. So if somebody comes without that data, right, we know from we've have to collect data for people before. That can be a pretty intensive process and sometimes an expensive process. And so what is the Quantpi sort of strategy around that? Do you use partners? Do you try to internally do it as much as you can? Do you have to coach the clients to on the process? Like, what's the what's the variety of ways in which you try to mitigate that?
Well, I would say the easiest way is to check for some reliable open source data sets, publicly available data sets, which are good with the licenses and so on. That would be the first way to go. The other way is to just request the customer if they can provide the data. Typically, they actually provide the data. But the main challenge would be is that the number of data points is typically low to actually generate any results that are valuable. On a high level, they get to know the performance, but if the customer wants reliable results, which they can actually take it into production, for example, then I would say we need more data to an extent. And I would say maybe in the near future, it could be that synthetically generated data becomes more prominent, and it can also potentially help with testing of AI.
Yeah. And so, are people able to use, are companies? So, one of the big issues of it that companies are facing is EU AI Act, right? And so, compliance, February 2nd is the sort of first round of a sort of AI literacy and prohibited systems kind of compliance, but or AI literacy, and then it's not until August of 2026 that the high risk systems. However, the obligations are pretty extensive there, and one of them is sort of post market monitoring. So keeping track of the system, and so is does your platform has it are people trying to configure it in a way that they can use it for post market monitoring, or is it really just sort of for testing the models either prior to deployment or prior to like an update or something like that?
Yeah, definitely, I would say our main focus is pre-production, but at the same time, like it is totally possible to run the assessments on a regular interval basis and see if the performance is as intended or not, depending on the variations in the data set. But I think there are a lot of companies which have a focus on monitoring, but our focus is mainly on testing. It could be that you can test it during the monitoring phase on a regular intervals, but the focus is mainly before production.
That's uh, that's good. Yeah, I'd imagine you probably would just need to set up a separate mechanism to refresh the data with current production data, like whatever the evaluation data set. You might have to they'd have to set up a little system to refresh that.
Yeah, yeah. That's why it's important to test these kind of scenarios beforehand. So once you do rigorous testing, it's most often the case that the system is quite robust to changes in the data.
Yep. Yeah, it makes it more stable. So what what is the what is the I'm really interested in what you're hearing from clients. So in terms of why, so they're coming to you because we talked a little bit about the testing. There's a compliance is a big thing, but like, what is the most urgent thing you're seeing? Is it that they're worried about the regulations, so EU or some US regulations or elsewhere, and so they're kind of proactively trying to get compliant with those regulations, or is it procurement pressure where they're trying to sell their tools to enterprise and they're getting pushback about doing something about governance and risk management? Or maybe it's a combination. Like, what are you seeing in terms of the breakdown of what those motivations for those clients are?
I would say both, because I think there is definitely a lot of regulatory pressure, and at the same time, enterprises just want to avoid the operational risk and the reputational risk and so on and so forth. And it is imperative that they actually test their AI models rigorously before taking into production. And even if there is no regulatory pressure, it makes sense that enterprises actually test their AI models just to ensure that performance is as intended as how the enterprise wants it. And it needs to quantify it. Of course, the way the performance has to be quantified, but we have, at least in our cases, we have seen both ways, and at times in both of them included, like both the regulatory aspect and also the risk management standpoint aspect.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit for my final question. We do a lot of training here at BABL. In addition, we train our own auditors, and we also train other auditors and AI governance professionals and testing and evaluation specialists. So we have a lot of people who listen who are interested in getting into the field. And so my question to you is, given that you're in the field, you do this kind of work, like what do you see as, like, if you go back to your former self and you're thinking about the things that you are studying, the things you want to focus on, the self-learning, like what are the things, if someone wants to have your job, a job like yours, what would you say they should go prepare? What kind of things, topics they should study, and focus on, the skills they should gain?
Yeah, I would say having a rough knowledge about artificial intelligence and machine learning totally helps. At the same time, maybe focus a bit on the AI safety, trustworthy aspects like fairness, bias, and maybe a bit of robustness, and so on and so forth. I think this would definitely help, and having strong foundations of mathematics can also actually help with generating reliable risk assessments, and also quantify the uncertainty and so on and so forth. So that would definitely help, like the linear algebra, statistics, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, um, a strong programming knowledge also helps. uh, we typically use Python, but in principle, like a strong programming knowledge is also quite helpful. And apart from the technical aspects, just the human aspects of thinking about the use case, thinking about the scenarios, just from a non-technical standpoint, and analyzing the use case critically, and generating the scenarios, because usually these sort of critical thinking about the scenarios can actually uh, impact significantly the kind of assessments we do, and this would basically result in the kind of assessments we would in the end generate. So it's one thing to just write the code, it's another thing to think about what you are writing about essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think that it's nice to hear. It aligns, I think, with what we, in the courses we teach. We focus on the concept of the socio-technical algorithm, right? The AI, or the AI system, lives within a social environment, a business environment where people interact with it, and understanding that is that's a critical part to mitigating risk, and just knowing what to test for, even if you're technical focused. And so that aligns really well with what I think what we think about. Well, it was super exciting to talk to you. Thank you for coming by. It sounds like fascinating work. Quantpi sounds like a fascinating company, and can really help people comply with all of these regulations that are coming up. If you're listening to this on a podcast, thank you so much for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you. And if you like and subscribe, that helps us out a lot. And we'll see you again on the next Lunchtime Babbling.